was still a student at Grinnell at the time, interestingly. She graduated in 2010. She did not attend the class, but she told me later that I influenced at least one student to never go into the business world. So I actually take that with some grains of salt, but I think it's kind of interesting. Maybe I painted too negative a picture if that's true. That's not really my intent. But I am going to talk about, to some degree, ethics in the business world, but indirectly. So, but one thing I want to spend a little more time on than I have in the past is just sort of the overall career path that I've had, which is not, I think, typical of people. It may be typical for a lot of people from Grinnell, but I don't think it's what you would typically think of as a successful career in terms of the path. So as much as I think one would say that I had a successful career, it might not be due to taking a traditional path, and perhaps there's some lesson in there to be learned. But, why can't I advance the screen? There we go. A little bit of a delay. So, I showed this picture yesterday to the sustainability class. That's being built for people who've had very successful careers, who've taken perhaps more traditional routes. You can look at the people on the right and left. We all live together on Broad Street in a house that no longer exists because of an unfortunate fire. But it was on Broad Street, roughly across from about where Herrick Chapel would be on Park Street. On the left of the screen is Robert Kraft, who still teaches psychology at Otterbein University, and on my right is another housemate of mine at the time, Mark Ashbaugh, who got his doctoral degree in physics from Princeton and taught math for many, many years at the University of Missouri and has been retired for a while now. So this is sort of my timeline up to around 1978 from when I was born. I'm a baby boomer. I am actually a first-gen college graduate. Neither of my parents are college graduates. My father was, however, a successful self-taught engineer and actually developed a number of patents, so he was actually somewhat of an inspiration to me in some ways. He was an interesting person who never gave up teaching himself things and learning. He had an insatiable curiosity, which I think, at least to some degree, I inherited. I went to a public high school that wasn't a particularly high quality one. I did well. I participated in theater and debate and other things. I applied to Grinnell a year after I graduated from high school. I took a year off. I worked mostly, I was trying to do some social service work, and unfortunately it didn't work out as well. The resource that was going to pay for my work that year unfortunately ran out of money, so I spent most of the year actually painting houses, which wasn't a whole lot of fun, but I made a little money that helped me once I got into Grinnell. But I started at Grinnell in 1971, majored in philosophy and psychology. Like a lot of people, I don't think I knew exactly what I wanted to do, but I was a pretty serious student. I actually worked very hard for most of my classes. I was in the library a lot, and I enjoyed it. I had a very good time at Grinnell. Many of my friends come from that period in Grinnell even today, and I have very high regard for my education there. After I graduated, I went to Indiana University in the psychology department. I was in the doctoral program in psychology at IU, and I was almost by chance cast in with the resident mathematical psychologist at the IU program, became my advisor, and I became the guy who ran the computing lab within the psychology department at IU. I did graduate minor work in history and philosophy of science, and my thesis was about auditory memory. My research was both about speech perception and visual processes. But I think I came to, for various reasons, I did a master's degree, and I kind of balked at the idea of an academic career. And I decided to change my career. I signed up and became a law student at Ohio State in Columbus. I'm an Ohio native. And unfortunately, I realized pretty quickly after I did that I made a bad choice. I think that was just not me. It's my nature is I'm very interested in science, even though I did well in things like debate back when I was in high school. I don't think that I would have made a particularly good lawyer. I may have done okay, but it just wasn't something that I really wanted to do once I got there. And also at the same time, the little very unhappy statement there, I learned that my father had terminal cancer, and so it was not really a very good time in my life for a lot of ways. And my brother was in law school at the same time, also in Columbus, Ohio, but at Catholic University. And there was kind of a joint decision there to some degree, but I went home and spent some time with my father. So I went back and I took a job at a local company in my hometown, Form Scientific, and I worked as a technical writer for a little while. And then my dad died in late 1978, and I'm kind of getting old. I'm about 28 at this point, and I don't really have a career or a career path, but I've got some skills. So I developed a skill as a technical writer. I take a job as a technical writer with a company in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is a hardware and software manufacturer. They no longer exist, but like many tech companies. At the time, tech is a growing field. Content was founded by a number of former IBM engineers. It was actually a pretty interesting place to work. I have stayed in touch with a couple of people that worked there with me, and many people say it was a very enjoyable time in their life and that they learned a lot working there, and I did too. I took some undergraduate courses at night in areas which I had never studied before, economics, accounting. I was thinking at the time, well, maybe I could get an MBA and then it makes some sense. But I also decided I was maybe a little far away from the rest of my family, and I kind of almost arbitrarily decided to go back to Ohio at some point, and there I took a job as a basically developing statistical computer programs, which is based on the work I'd done in graduate school at Indiana. So I worked for a consulting firm in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was at one time in Baltimore. I did some work for the Kroger company in Cincinnati, Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals, which was bought and sold 2 or 3 different times. I again did another undergraduate course at night in chemistry with the vague fantasy that, hey, maybe I'll go to medical school. I'm only 30 at this point, but you sort of think about it. If I did enough chemistry, I could conceivably get in, and the University of Cincinnati has some pretty good programs. But this is also during a very severe recession, the 1980-81 period. I was still working, but the consulting firm I was working with at the time was having problem developing contracts, and they were beginning to lay people off. I was actually not I decided to go out on my own, which is maybe a dumb thing, but I used, to some degree, connections that I had developed to get a job working with Kroger. I wasn't an employee, but rather I was an independent consultant to them. This was based on some work that I'd done through a consulting firm. I was to the Human Resources Department, who kind of took a liking to me, I think, and decided that I would make a good analyst of their human resources data based on my background in psychology and my understanding of statistics and other sorts of things. So I did that for a couple of years, actually. What we learned is that was perhaps a missed opportunity. So to expect I could have taken that into a lot of different things and done some interesting work with it, but I don't think I realized that at the time, that I was actually being given quite a chance to do something pretty interesting. Whoop. Getting a slow network connection message there. Wants me to turn off my webcam. Should I do that?
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Okay. Okay. Oh, now I see everybody else. All right. So here I am in 1981. So I tried to put a few pictures of myself in here as I age. I'm still a young guy, but I'm what, 29 in this photo? So that's me at Christmas time at my mother's house. That's a picture taken by my brother. I think we got her reduced. Anyway. So this kind of continues to be. I decided after thinking about holding on the skills that I already had. I was realizing computing was going to be a big thing, both in general knowledge of computer science and developing computer systems, which is what I was doing on a consulting basis, that I could make a career out of this that would be reasonably successful. By 1980, what I did was I talked myself into the PhD program in computer science at the University of Illinois, which is a good program. And I got in as I guess you call it a provisional student. They admitted a number of people that way because I had no undergraduate credits in computer science. And although my math was pretty good, it wasn't great. So they essentially put me in a program where I took some undergraduate courses along with graduate courses, but took them for graduate credit by doing extra work. They had this sort of set up for people that were non-traditional entries into the program. I believe that there were 3 or 4 of us along that path. I did most of the work to a doctorate, but I never wrote my thesis. So I went back to work. I came back to Cincinnati, and I went back to doing consulting work and quickly became a consultant to Procter & Gamble. This was through a local consulting firm which placed me there. They tended to like me. I also did some part-time work with a number of academics who were doing interface consulting at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base under Air Force contracts. It's kind of odd stuff, but essentially you're trying to figure out what or they were trying to figure out how to design military cockpits and the like for the benefit of military pilots so that they could execute their jobs without risk and without failure. So my job was only a very small part of that was to look at academic articles about human factors and performance that are relevant to some of this design work and edit them and select them for relevance to the program. 1988, I left that and went to work for Computer Sciences Corporation at the US EPA in Cincinnati, where I joined the artificial intelligence group at Computer Sciences Corporation. We, as well as working with a program to move all their statistical systems from North Carolina to Cincinnati. This is, at this point in my career, interestingly, I got involved in some things that got some fairly high recognition, at least within the EPA, for improving their programs, which was kind of nice. I worked on a system for identifying regulations on Superfund sites, which was taken out to a national systems conference for artificial intelligence in the San Francisco area, where it won an award for cost-benefit advantages. Steve Jobs of Apple Computer presented that award, which was kind of nice. I wasn't there. They didn't have enough. CSC sent one of the people on our team, and I wasn't that person, as it turned out. So I merely got to see the pictures. And here sort of is a recent picture of me. Somewhere I skipped a slide here. Oh, here we go. That's what I skipped. And then by 1991, I'm back doing consulting work with Procter & Gamble. By 1997, Procter & Gamble decides to hire me to manage an internal group called the Statistical Computing Group within Procter & Gamble Pharmaceuticals. I continued to work for Procter & Gamble from 1997 until 2012. They sold the pharmaceuticals business in around 2003, which is why I transferred over to being a data scientist in the rest of the healthcare business. I decided to stay with the company. I didn't particularly want to go with the company to whom they were selling their pharmaceutical business. And I stayed with them just about 15 years total, which was enough for me to acquire a full retirement package at age 60 from P&G, which meant that they paid me about a year's salary and gave me a number of attractive benefits. But I also realized that I would continue to work, as I have, mostly doing consulting. So P&G has a strong reputation in the Cincinnati area, which means that I could kind of leverage connections and other things, and did work with Luxottica Corporation, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, a local firm called Data Intensity, and a insurance data science firm called Cotiviti, which is actually based in Atlanta. I worked for them until sometime last year, and currently I'm working as a consultant doing data science work with Tri-Health Hospital. So I found a place more recently in the healthcare area where I'm enjoying the work that I do and trying to apply data science for the benefit of healthcare practices. And there is a picture of me that's relatively contemporary that was taken by my brother playing putt-putt golf a couple of years ago. You see that? I guess there's a delay on the main screen, I can tell.
Yeah, there's about a 40-second delay or something.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'll try to compensate for that. Okay, I'll wait for that to catch up a second. I'm not sure why it's so slow. We didn't have this problem yesterday. What I wanted to talk about in the main is one of the projects that I was involved with at Procter & Gamble. So this was, when I was hired in 1997, there's the picture of me playing miniature golf. I really started working on this project on a consulting basis from 1993 and worked on the same project till almost 2001, which is the next slide coming up. But this was a big deal at Procter & Gamble. It was P&G had the ambition of becoming a major pharmaceutical company as well as a major consumer goods household products company. So this project was given a commitment by the chief technical officer of P&G, and they had some high-powered consultants from outside the company involved in this. And I was one of the first kind of technical people hired on the project to actually make it work. But the advantage was to, P&G already owned a pharmaceuticals company that they had. It was a small pharmaceutical company that they had acquired with the purchase of Richardson Vicks, which there was a Richardson Vicks pharmaceutical branch. They were known mostly for things like Vicks cough syrup and cough drops and that sort of thing. But they also had actually licensed pharmaceutical drugs as well. And internally within Procter & Gamble, they were developing an osteoporosis drug without being a pharmaceutical company, which is another story, but it actually came out of research in detergents, but people there realized that this had potential as a pharmaceutical. So part of the idea was to begin to build a branch of the Procter & Gamble company that would become a significant player in pharmaceuticals. So as part of that, they need to develop the infrastructure, and for the most part, they're hiring people from outside of their traditional lines of work. They didn't hire me, at least first. I came in as a consultant. My background obviously isn't in pharmaceutical science exactly. But the objective was to build a capability to generate all of the clinical trial outputs that go along with an NDA, a new drug application, that this is typically a large stack of paper. It used to be paper, now it's more electronic communications. But it's all sorts of tables and graphs and other things showing how well a drug is performing in clinical trials. And for acceptance of major pharmaceutical agents, these things run thousands and thousands of pages with hundreds of tables broken out over time. And at least at the time, it's become more true that the FDA is asking for data and they standardly analyze it themselves, at least in some cases. But it was more true then, it's still true to some degree. Companies are responsible for producing a lot of that summary data themselves and just presenting it to the FDA, to regulators. But more and more the FDA gets packages of data where they kind of self-analyze it, so both mechanisms are working. But the idea is that if you have a pharmaceutical agent that can make money, it is a terrible waste of time if you are delayed by producing all of this information after the trials have become successful. So the idea is to automate the ability to produce that sort of information for the FDA and do it directly from a clinical database. So most pharmaceutical companies were actually working on this same problem in different ways, something that wasn't obvious to me at the time. And this bottom's about to switch here in a few seconds. I was the first person on the systems team to help develop it, who came in from a consulting basis. I was hired mostly because I had, at that time, a fair amount of experience. I worked with the internal Procter & Gamble pharmaceutical project manager to create the initial systems design document, which was kind of a pie in the sky thing. We did it from interviews, information that we could gather, but it was not that it was somewhat of a high-level document. It reflected the information we could get at the time, but we really didn't use that document a lot. And eventually things begin to boil down into specific ways to execute this design. And there also became more people involved, so there's the manager and there's myself and about 3 or 4 other people that are contributing to the design. And in many cases, the manager kind of overruled us. and said that I wasn't the only person who was kind of overruled, but he made a lot of the the decisions on his own. And so, there was at some point some disagreement about that, but you do what you can do. I'm an outsider. I could not, my vote was worth only as good as my opinions about it. By late 1994, there's about 8 or 9 people involved in this. And I'm responsible for most of the internal mechanics of the system. The problems begin to emerge from about 1997 with this system. By this time, there were actually a couple of people who were on the team internally from Procter & Gamble who had actually written a document, which I agreed with, although I was not a signatory to it, that said that the system was probably going to not work as it was anticipated to do, and that we were having problems. As an outsider, I actually talked to people inside the organization I was working with, and I made the conscious decision not to sort of sign off on this, even though I agreed with it, but let the folks who were internal go forward with this, and I was sort of supporting them. This went up to a vice president within Procter & Gamble, who essentially dismissed the criticism and said that he was going with the decisions of his managers, and that he thought that the technical people on the team's criticism was wrong, and that they were not being particularly good team players. So anyway, it's by 1997 this thing is actually beginning to be used, and there's about $20 million invested in it over the 5 years since it was started by 1992. It's being cited as a success within the company. There are active pharmaceutical agents that are being reported through it. It's basically working, so I'm going to say that it was a failure in terms of not being able to produce outputs. The problem was that it was very, very difficult to manage and maintain, and the truth was very few people at that point really understood how it worked. So I'm having conversations privately with a person in the area who is sort of the one-up level manager. He's not a director, but he's a section head, under whose control a lot of this system got started. And I'm telling him, just sort of in private conversations, that if P&G continues to use this, they're going to have problems. So it's really through those conversations that I get hired. They decide, the internal IT manager is shuffled off to another project, and they decide that I should be running this project at this point. But I've already have not only the background through the 5 years that I've been there, as it turns out I probably know more about it than anybody else, but I also have, I'm probably the only person left who actually understood all of it at that point. So in a way, they pretty much had to hire me from a technical point of view, because quite literally, there are people that understand parts, but I think that there was one other individual who probably understood enough of it that they could conceivably have taken over management, but the reality of it was they had already left and were, I believe, working at another company. So as soon as I'm hired, basically, I write a memo saying we need to somehow rebuild this or we're going to have some problems. It's not that folks up the line through management don't know that that's true, but they've spent so much money that no one wants to talk terribly publicly about it. So to some extent, it's kind of a hard sell to get this to be changed and to get resources to do it. One thing we did was by 1999, we did a formal study of how this thing was being used. And the reality was, even though it was being given credit for a lot of work, very often it wasn't really used as intended, but rather people took pieces of the system we built, literally pieces of code out of the system, and modified them and then used those to execute and commit their work. The problem with the system is it's people who are sort of familiar with the vernacular of computer systems in general would describe this as a kludge, which is a word that became popular in World War II, actually. It describes an ill-assorted collection of parts assembled to fulfill a particular purpose, but the elements aren't real well matched. So, and that's a fair description of what we had. It's not that it didn't work, sort of, it just didn't work very well. And it depended too much on the knowledge of particular people to be able to make it work, namely me. And you don't really want that. So when you look at how this happened, well, it's not the case that people were, for the most part, there was some deception along the line about this, because I think a lot of people realized that this was true, but didn't want to say it. But the design suffered from this characteristic I call described as being too clever by half. There were a lot of things about the design that were overthought, and there was complexity that wasn't really necessary. And that's part of what made it unreliable, is that you would look at this very complicated code and you would realize sometimes that it really, in the end, didn't do something that couldn't have been done with something that was much, much more simple. So, in retrospect, this was kind of something that propelled my career, because, although there isn't a slide about this, eventually I kind of turned this thing around. We rebuilt it. We did this while we were maintaining the existing system. We did it with a lot less resources than were committed to the original system. We expanded the capabilities of it. We actually built a pretty strong model computer program that, when Procter & Gamble ended up selling P&G Pharmaceuticals, our system was sold off to another pharmaceutical company as intellectual property. It was also used as some of we worked with a software partner on some of this as well, and that partnership generated some additional work for that partner with Genentech and a number of other firms that kind of put them on the map as a successful company. So eventually a lot of success came out of this because we learned from our mistakes. But what I want to talk about is the sort of sociology here of why this was a problem in the first place. And it was true that myself and at least 3 or 4 other people who were on the team, even back as early as 1995, which was 5 years before we fixed it, realized that this was going to be a problem. And the problem was that you couldn't really tell anyone that, because they didn't want to listen. And we kind of, I mean, the 2 people went forward with a memo, that didn't work. I had private conversations with the manager, that didn't work. He basically dismissed my opinions as well. There were a number of attempts to kind of get this message communicated that this wasn't going to be what they really wanted. And the kind of question is, why within this large organization, which is investing all this money, and actually in large part betting a significant part of the success of their growing pharmaceutical business, why they would make these mistakes. And I think it actually was almost a textbook case of groupthink, which some of you may have heard of. There's business slides about this. The term groupthink comes from a 1960s psychologist who wrote a paper about it, and it's the 1989 Challenger disaster, where the Challenger rocket blew up and killed some of our astronauts. It's considered to be a case of groupthink. Engineers knew that they had cold O-rings and that they were dangerous, but that message was somehow ignored. This was actually a similar case. In terms of the team, I'm here on this slide describing the characteristics of what I saw when this happened. And our team would have these team meetings, and we'd work together and we'd prep ourselves and we'd kind of cheer each other on. And this was all at the direction of our project manager, but personally I thought it kind of became really got overboard. It's as if what was wrong here was that there was no room for critical thinking. People who were actually thinking about what was wrong with the system, there was simply no path that we had to really talk about it. And the people going up the line, directors, vice president, and chief technical officer of the company and other people were essentially shielded from all those criticisms. It was all kept at a very low level. There were people at low levels who knew about the problems and were aware of it, but for the most part, that stopped pretty much at the level of director, and it took a long time to kind of get him on board to it. And then I don't think it really went past that till 1999, when really maybe people at the vice president level of the company began to realize that this was a screwed up system. This sort of thing happens, I think, in business a lot more than people sometimes recognize. And I've seen this problem occur elsewhere in my career, interestingly. Later I saw something vaguely similar happen when I was working on some projects, not perhaps with as much money involved, but I saw similar things happen in projects that I was helping to develop at Luxottica, some data science work and other things. People tend to be very optimistic about how they're going to solve business problems, and they don't want to recognize that some things are more difficult than they are. But so one of the things I kind of did on the side as a result of this experience was I started to make a study of the social psychology. Of course, I'm basically trained as a psychologist originally, so I find this interesting. And as I looked in the literature, I found pretty much things that described exactly what I saw happen. People used language euphemisms in the system that we were developing at P&G. So one of the things that was real strong there was people talked about how we were in maintenance mode when we hadn't met expectations for actually developing as much capability in the system as at such and such a date as we had committed to doing. We were way behind schedule is what it amounted to, and leaders went into the manager's office and said, rather than admitting that truth, they simply said, well, we're going to go to maintenance mode, but what they really meant was we're still developing the capability that we are claiming we are maintaining. So in a sense, they were kind of being untruthful about that. And there were other things. I mean, there were meetings where people said things to upper level managers that were clearly misleading. And I later had the chance, I think when this thing, the emotions of it died down enough, I had the chance to actually have a couple of frank conversations with some of the people involved and just kind of ask them, what motivated you to do what you did? And it's interesting because what people will tell you is they believe they were doing the right thing in saying, well, if I hadn't said that, we wouldn't have gotten the funding we needed to do the next step, for example. Okay, so in other words, you're miscommunicating a reality because of a potential loss of funding. And then one of the other characteristics you saw in this was that people kept citing rules about this is the way we do things. These practices work, they're established, so on. So whatever we're doing, it can't be wrong because, you know, we've already said that it works. It's the way we do it. The other thing that I learned is that a lot of times when problems start to become revealed, people focus on other people rather than the network of influence. So when we were having problems at first, the first people to get blamed for them were actually the people who were right about saying that the system was flawed. The two individuals who wrote a memo saying that the first wrote a memo saying that the system was going to have problems. One of them left the company after being reassigned to a much less interesting and influential project, and the other person was basically kind of put off in another area where they were far away from it, but doing things that weren't particularly highly valued. So the company had its own way of sort of punishing people that were naysayers. It's soft punishment, if you will, but it's interesting that, you know, essentially Procter & Gamble, at least at the time, so much emphasized consensus that just by virtue of saying that you're disagreeing with the way something's done, you were putting yourself at risk. So one of the references to looking at this that I found is, there's the article citing, it's an interesting source in the Social Justice Research Journal. But essentially I'm arguing that some of the people at the top of this project were engaged in a kind of self-deception. And I think that that's true. The problem was that the problem in some of the individual thinking at a leadership level was once you have made a commitment to a certain point, and even if you learn that there are problems, you can't give up on that commitment. You kind of narrowed your opportunity. There's a strong unwillingness to change course. And I can understand that. But the problem becomes when you are no longer able to actually accurately evaluate the nature of the risks involved. I mean, what are the real probabilities that you're going to succeed with the course of action you're taking? What are the probabilities and costs involved in changing? And do you want to have an honest conversation about that? And a lot of people kind of voted no in this project on that. So also related to this are, this goes a little further, but I think people do not understand how much a frame of reference makes a difference in human behavior, in making ethical decisions. And that is that the culture of P&G as the whole, on the whole, in terms of management and success is viewed in the company. Everyone is kind of on an upward path, and there's almost an unwritten rule that folks do not admit their mistakes, and people kind of covered for one another, and you explained away anything that kind of went wrong. And you saw this really throughout the company as a whole, very, very often. The problem is that there's some times when that's just going to get you in a lot of trouble. There are times on maybe minor things it doesn't make that much difference, but certainly in the context of some big programs, it makes a difference. And this is something that, interestingly, the company as itself began to talk a lot more about in the period after this work was done. There was an open forum developed, and we saw a whole conversation develop around how this was actually an unfortunate aspect of the corporate culture. So, at a very general level, what do I think one could kind of take out of this experience? Well, one is there are limitations to any any single individual, myself included. I made mistakes when I started taking over the management of this, something I did mention earlier. Some of my very first ideas to how to fix the problems we had were complete failures. I started an internal project to look at a certain company's software and framework for doing things as a way to solve and use some of the work that we had done. And I spent about, I think, $60,000, $80,000 on this examination of the software. And after that was started and once we got done, I think myself and everyone else agreed that it wasn't going to work. And we wrote up a report saying that we all agreed that it would work. But even that wasn't very popular. That report went forward, and there were people who told me that I shouldn't even admit that I had made bad judgment there. And my viewpoint was, if I'm not going to admit my mistakes after I've taken over this project and there's already been $20 million spent on other people making mistakes, that's not the sort of thing I want to do. So I said, if somebody wants to talk about this with me, that's fine. But my public position is the same as my private one, which is I'm responsible for these things, and you can do what you want about that. That's just the way it goes. And not every decision that I make or anybody else makes is going to be right. But the other thing I think that's a lesson out of this is, and when we did begin to get it right, it was because we got a lot of different people involved who had good opinions, and we disagreed with one another. And I sort of used a method of encouraging people to speak up. So the lesson there is simply that a diversity of opinion makes a big difference. And then the other lesson I think from this is that social networks of influence and frames of reference in which people operate, the culture, so to speak, are often much more important than people think. I don't think anyone involved in this is someone who I would characterize as a flawed person necessarily. I think that the greater reality is that what I learned is that the nature of a corporate culture itself directs most of what one sees coming out of that. And internally, I think that one of the, at least, I don't know how much this echoed throughout the entire company. I think it echoed pretty well within pharmaceuticals, which of course is a part of the business that got sold. But I think there was a general learning from this and from a couple other projects that had similar problems, and that is that you really need to think about how you have set up protocols to allow dissent and allow people to speak up, and how you value disagreement. So when I kind of took over this project, that was one of the first things that I set about doing, was trying to redefine the rules and the culture in which we played. So when I go into meetings, I didn't just say to people, tell me what you've done and how well this is going and other things. I would ask them to tell me what is going wrong, why it's going wrong, and what we can do about it, and to also ask them for their criticisms about what I'm doing, what the way the project is working, the way other things are working. So I tried to kind of use those rules throughout the rest of the time that I managed this group and really the rest of my career at P&G. So here's, I guess we still have this little deck. But this is sort of a summary on the next slide coming up here in a second. We'll start up showing basically the kind of rules that I put in place when I kind of took over this group. So I focused on the idea that we should keep our original goals in mind and critically review whether the actions we are taking are actually the best way to satisfy those goals. The idea was to try to prevent drift from that. I was open about inviting criticism I made a rule not to suppress disagreement, and rather I tried to simply make sure that disagreement when it occurred was constructive. And part of that was to actually get people involved in one another's work. So one of the differences in the way I kind of ran the design process for the replacement was most people didn't just work in one area. We did a lot of trade-offs where other people got to experience what another role on the team would be like. So people weren't fixed exactly in their roles. I sort of made a strong emphasis on honesty, but I was forgetting about anything that, you know, if there are good reasons for missing something or making a bad judgment, that's fine. I don't, you know, I have no problem with that. Also, I invested a lot of effort in trying to make sure that our customers were involved in ownership, as were all of the people that were involved in creating the new system as a team. And so that's kind of the end of that story, but it gets to, I think, something that I kind of learned through managing this process that I took into the rest of my career whenever I'm involved in team efforts and processes, and even in consulting I try to emphasize a lot of those values. Another sort of aspect of this is a little different. This is something which you will find also a fair amount of literature in psychology and business on, which is halo effects. The idea that if somebody has done something well, or you know, has fairly positive attributes, that translates into a lot of other things. So within P&G, there's a general belief, or there was a general belief, that this is a very high quality company. They are the best at what they do in the business. So there's kind of a belief among people that if you've moved up through that system at a certain point, that means that it's because of your individual talents are in fact superior to those of other people. My argument is that sometimes that's wrong, and that what this really is kind of a judgment of halo. In other words, the success of the company is transferring to individuals and the belief that people can't fail because the company as a whole is doing well. And in the 1990s, by the way, Procter & Gamble was an enormously successful company. Their stock prices got fantastically well. They were executing very well. People were getting nice raises. I was getting nice raises. It was a great place to work for a while. They had a cafeteria where they hired a 4-star chef to prepare our meals at lunch. So we were treated very well. The problem with that is that to some extent, you're kind of saying, well, it's because you're really such smart people that you deserve this. But was that really true, or are we just lucky? And I think the truth to that is, in some sense, we were in fact just lucky. And I thought that also at the time a little bit, that it kind of went a little bit overboard. That also is something about this convoluted culture that you sometimes get in corporations. But the other side of this is what I call the halo effect, which is that success transfers itself in different aspects of someone's behavior, even though that aspect of the behavior might not be responsible for the success that someone is seeing. And this goes back to 1920s work by the psychologist Thorndike, who noticed that soldiers who were evaluated on one quality tended to be highly rated on other qualities, even though there was probably no relationship between those things in any causal or reasonable way. That's, I'm trying to give a kind of academic look at some of the things that I saw in this part of my career. A book on the halo effect about business, which is an interesting book. I talked about this a little bit more last semester when I talked to the innovation class, but I want to mention this because I actually think that for people who are interested in business careers, this is actually not always a book that you see recommended a lot. I think that it's actually a really good book. It explains a lot of things that happen in business and why what you see may actually have a lot more to do with almost random effects than they do with the success of particular individuals or their business genius. So the book, The Halo Effect by Phil Rosenzweig, is something that deserves to be read in my opinion. And I would also say that this is something that anyone can see operating every day. The halo effects are kind of ever present in the way we deal with reality. An example from politics and not too distant history is, why did George Bush's ratings go up so immensely well after 9/11 for his handling of the economy? Was he suddenly handling the United States economy a lot better than before 9/11? No. I mean, in fact, nothing absolutely changed about his policies, but his public perception that he was suddenly doing a much better job with the economy went sky high. And of course, that there's no reason for that. It doesn't really make sense, except for the fact that people are saying, well, he is successfully handling the response to terrorism, and therefore he's a great man and he's doing a good job with the economy. Of course, probably by 2008, a lot of people had changed their mind about a number of those opinions. But what I'm saying is that this kind of halo effect logic plays out in all sorts of ways. And I think here I'd like to go back to some of the ideas that you kind of learn from this, and that is, or what I think I've learned from it, and that is that because of this, if you do something in your career, you're going to be known for that. That's going to be your advantage, and that will probably give you additional opportunities. And doesn't mean you will execute those opportunities well, but it means people will recognize that you have exercised at least some sort of talent and tend to give you a chance or promote you and move you up to do other things. Opportunities are also created by a lot of things that just happen. So my point would be that if you are a broad thinker, and if in your career you can play off of the success you've had and use that to leverage your opportunities in ways to your advantage, which is really what I did at P&G. I ended up having a pretty good career there and made a lot more money than I started out doing, and maybe more than I actually deserved in some ways. But I think part of that I attribute to the benefits of a good liberal arts education that allowed me to kind of think broadly about what was going on in solving a problem. It wasn't really some sort of great technical knowledge that I had as much as it was simply a realization that we needed to, as a team, think a little bit differently about how we were going about solving this problem, and actually understanding the social nature of the way the team was operating and changing it so that we could then build a much better product. So the other kind of broad lesson out of this experience, I think, or the story that I was trying to tell, is that your general knowledge is sometimes a lot more important than specific knowledge that you actually have, or very sort of hard science knowledge about something. It wasn't my computer science understanding that made that project a success by any means. It was rather my understanding about social dynamics more than that. Another thing I think is a generality that might be helpful to people is that things will happen in your career that you don't expect, that seem to come out of nowhere, and a lot of, if you're in the sort of business world or you don't have a specific career that's maybe a lawyer or doctor or something where there's constant demand. Of course, that isn't necessarily true for lawyers, but for medical professionals, it's still pretty good. But if you're in more open or business environment,